Hello, welcome to everyone joining. Thank you for joining us. We will be starting shortly. Welcome to everyone that's joined. Just waiting for a few more people to join and we'll be starting shortly. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Forever Maryland Foundation's webinar, Personal Resilience, the Mental and Physical Benefits of Open Space. My name is Trisha Clark, and I am the Director of Meetings at the Forever Maryland Foundation. Please be aware that all participant lines will be muted during the session to provide for the best sound quality. If you have any questions or any technical difficulties during the session, please use the chat feature as it will be monitored throughout the session. The chat feature can be found in your Zoom control panel. And if you're still having technical difficulties, please email info@forevermaryland.org. If you cannot hear the audio through your computer speakers, you can call in using the call-in number and meeting ID sent to you on your Zoom registration confirmation email. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be available for download on our website at a future date. Questions will be answered by the presenters throughout the webinar, so you don't have to wait until the end of the presentation. We encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A box in your control panel. Today's webinar will be approximately 60 minutes, and now I'd like to hand over to the Forever Maryland Foundation's Program and Policy Director, Josh Hastings, who will introduce today's speakers.
Thank you, Tricia, and thank you all for attending. We've got a great year of webinars planned. This is a very exciting one, the very first one to kick it off, and we were excited to have you all here. I'd like to introduce our speakers today. That is Dr. Heidi Schrieber-Pan and Dr. Jennifer Roberts. Dr. Schrieber-Pan is a successful psychotherapist, author, clinical director, and sought-after nationwide speaker on topics of resilience, anxiety, neuroscience, and occupational burnout. As an affiliate and former faculty member of Loyola University, her past research is focused on resiliency and psychological well-being, including nature-based mental health. Dr. Jennifer Roberts is an assistant professor in the Department of Kinesiology in the School of Public Health at the University of Maryland. She's also the founder and director of Public Health Outcomes and Effects of the Built Environment, also known as Phoebe, the laboratory. And she's also the co-founder and co-director of Nature RX at University of Maryland. This initiative emphasizes natural environments, the benefits, and then interspersed throughout Maryland and the UMD campus. Her scholarship focuses on the impact of built and social and natural environments, including the institutional and structural inequities of these environments on the public health outcomes of marginalized communities. Before we hear from Heidi and Jennifer, I'd like to take a moment to, of course, thank our webinar sponsors. That would be, of course, our presenting sponsor, the Helena Foundation, and I also should mention the Harry R. Hughes Center for Agroecology is our webinar sponsors for this year. And of course, our lead sponsor of Forever Maryland, that is the Maryland Environmental Trust. So I would like to now turn it over to Dr. Heidi Schrieber-Pan. Heidi?
Thank you, Josh, and thanks everybody for joining. Josh, that was a wonderful introduction, but I have a slide here that introduces me with a visual. So my name is Dr. Heidi Schreiber-Pan, as Josh said, and I have dedicated my life to connecting nature and mental health together. But it really started there in that beautiful image that we see of the Alps in Europe. This is actually the Italian side of the Alps, called the Dolomites. And I was lucky enough to grow up in the Alpine region of southern Bavaria. And this was, sort of speak, my playground growing up, skiing in the mountains in the winter and hiking them in the summer. So never to say that nature has become a personally very meaningful thing for me, and I realized that I wanted to also help others connect nature and mental health with each other. So, but before we started, I was wondering if we could do a little poll to find out what landscape is most restorative to you. So when we're talking about mental health and nature, think about, what landscape do you find most restorative? Is it the mountains or the oceans or a walk in the woods? Or is it your own backyard that feels most restorative to you? So go ahead and participate in this little poll to see what we get here from most restorative landscape to you. Okay, we've got a close tie here between the mountains and lakes and the ocean and seashore. All right, and we got all 20 votes in, a little bit over 20 votes, and we have a tie between mountains and lakes and ocean and seashore as the most restorative landscape for you. Thanks for participating. Okay. So we do nature-informed therapy at Chesapeake Mental Health. Now, why is that important? Why do we have to do nature-informed therapy? Well, one of the reasons is that we believe that the disconnection from nature is a fundamental contributor to mental and physical health problems for everyone. And that reconciliation therapy is necessary to address the human and nature estrangement. At a time when the destruction of our home planet is the most significant issue facing humanity today, reconciliation will result in a deeper level of caring for nature and a greater conservation involvement. So, in essence, I decided to integrate nature into mental health therapy, not only because we know that it is so restorative, as we just saw in the poll, but also that our disconnect from the natural world is actually one of the reasons we see such an elevation in anxiety and depression and other mental health issues. And until we really address that fundamental root of that disconnection leading to mental health issues. Until then, we can't find sustainable mental health treatment. So, why is that so important? Well, our story doesn't start in 2021. The human story starts a long time ago. And so we have to look that throughout evolution, we spent over 90% of our time in nature. Our physiology is still adapted to it, meaning that our body and our brain actually evolved. 99.9% of our human evolution took place outdoors. Quite different from what we're seeing today in 2021, when most of our hours are spent indoors, and often our work environment is in front of screens and digitally technology oriented. Now, our senses are still adapt to interpret information from plants and streams, not so much from traffic and high rises. So, Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson talked about biophilia. And biophilia is the humans have an innate, or we're hardwired for interaction with other life forms, for the more than human life forms. So, We talked about just now how much of our human evolution has taken place outdoors in natural settings. And then since the industrial revolutions, we've really moved indoors. So what's the consequence of that? And in order for us to really look at the consequence, we need to look at the eco separation, what eco separation has done to us as a human species. Well, we're seeing species loneliness and domestication. So species loneliness is really this idea that the Homo sapien human beings are one of the only species on this planet that mostly interact only with their own species. We have very limited interaction with other species. And so some scholars have come up with this construct called species loneliness, really feeling lonely within our own species because we're no longer reaching out and having interaction with other species. And if we think about what our hunting and gathering world looked like, there was constant interaction with the more than human world. Another construct that I wanted to introduce you to is this idea of domestication. Domestication is really this idea that humans, as we are today, are a domesticated version of the Homo sapien. So we are, in some way, addicted to comfort. We need to have it 72 degrees at all times, right? And therefore, we have become a very domesticated, addicted to comfort type of species. And there are repercussions for that. And I see those repercussions in mental health by our inability to really cope, a lack of coping skills, because we are just so comfortable at all times. Place blindness refers to this idea that um, nowadays children can identify 9 different computer languages but are unable to identify the names of trees in their own backyard. And so this idea is that we've become blind to the places and spaces that we inhabit, and that again only contributes to more disconnect from the natural world. And sensory amnesia is really this idea that our hunting and gathering ancestors had a much better ability to use their senses. They were able to smell and hear and taste and feel things, so many more senses than we actually have today. And if we think about it, we don't really need to so much anymore because we're spending most of our time indoors. And therefore, we really don't have to be able to smell different things and hear different things because in some way we're kind of safe inside. Wendell Berry once said that knowing who you are by knowing where you are. And in some way, some scholars believe that the Homo sapien has become a little lost in our understanding of where we belong in the ecosystem. Again, sensory amnesia, 5 senses, try 30 or more. Richard Louv, in his book in 2012, talked about that we can develop so many nuances with our senses through the interaction with the environment. The lack of sensory stimulation from the rich and diverse ecosystem and life forms that our nervous system really evolved with. And an eco boredom refers to sort of the slowing of pace, and addiction to fast stimulation of the brain. Now, um, what I have noticed recently is people that are standing in line at the grocery store. Pretty much most of them are on their phones. And so checking their emails or looking something up. And it really points to this idea that we are no longer used to the slowing of pace. We're addicted to this fast stimulation of the brain. So at Chesapeake Mental Health, we focus on stress and anxiety disorders. And what we have found is there's been a strong uptick in anxiety and stress disorders. And I really do believe that it is a consequence of moving indoors. So I want to give you an example with this slide of sort of your processing, your brain, what your brain does with processing. So if we look at the upper right corner, what we see is a picture. It's actually my son. He's fishing. We're in Wyoming. This is a backpacking trip that we took into the snowies in Wyoming. And what you see is sort of what the brain is needing to process in that moment. We know that the brain, when it's in natural environments, is what we call soft fascination. And soft fascination refers to your brain is alert and stimulated, but also relaxed at the same time. And so there's not a whole lot of fast-paced stimulation coming in. Now, if you look at the bottom right corner, this shows a scene of sort of a modern day office environment. Lots of sort of multitasking involved with socializing, looking at the computer screens. And again, our brain is able to do that. But what we have to understand is that is prefrontal cortex processing. That is really right behind your forehead here is your executive functioning of your brain. And your brain can do that, but it is never meant to do it all the time. And we think about it, we get up in the morning, we check our emails, we go on through the day. And so we have this constant asking our brain to constantly do this higher processing. And it's really not evolved to do that. And so we see that through this constant fast-paced processing and multitasking, we're really stressing out a system that is more meant for one-way processing. And nature works by lowering stress. We see that 16% decrease in cortisol and 2% blood pressure drop within 20 minutes of walking in forest environments. So our nervous system is really apt with being in forest settings. Mental fatigue, it's this constant daily treadmill of tasks, is wearing out our frontal lobes. And again, brain resting, which soft fascination, we see that happening within 20 minutes of walking in forest settings. Attention restoration theory, we see again that we renew attention after mental exertion, stress, and ADHD we have a real decrease in that. So previously established research, we see that nature and psychological well-being is correlated. We have here Abraham Maslow, a pretty famous psychologist, who said that the natural world is the most common environment for experiencing peak. And peak are moments of highest happiness and fulfillment. And then again, Frederick Olmsted in 1865 said what nowadays scholars call a soft fascination. And he's saying it exactly the way it is. It's viewing nature employs the mind without fatigue, yet it exercises it. It tranquilizes it and yet enlivens it. And it turns out that when our mind is in that kind of state, we see creativity happening and we see the stress response calming down. Before I go into my actual research that I did, I wanted to check to see if there were any questions to get to. So I'm going to check the chat here to see. So feel free to put in any questions so far. I don't
Heidi,
see any yet. Yeah, go ahead,
this
Trisha.
is Trisha. Yeah, we did have one. I see one that just has popped in here.
Wonderful.
We have a question. So you mentioned increase in stress and anxiety. How about increase in ADD diagnosis?
Okay. Yes, we absolutely see an increase in ADHD and ADD diagnoses. There are several hypotheses of when that, but coming from an environmental lens, what I do find is that the way we live our lives now is so much more stagnant, right? We don't really move our bodies very often. And again, doing hunting and gathering, when 90% of our body and brain evolved, we were constantly moving. There was constantly movement. We were walking, hunting, gathering. And so what our modern day lives now, there's a lot of sitting and we're asking the brain to pay attention, that prefrontal cortex asking it to constantly process. Again, we did not evolve in that kind of lifestyle. And so we see a lot of repercussions. And I do believe that when we're asking children to sit and be attentive for 8 hours a day, that is really counter of what our body and our brain evolved to do. Great question. Trisha, was there another question?
Yeah, there's another one here, and you kind of touched on it a little bit, but If you could talk about like the most pressing mental health issues today, and the ways that nature can help.
Right, right. Yes, that is exactly what I'm trying to do. Now, I will say that I find that anxiety is really at an epidemic level. And we really see it from children as young as 2 to 3 years old, to people that are, elderly, experiencing a lot of fears, phobias, OCD, but also a lot of generalized anxiety disorders, which means that there's this constant worrying mindset. And so I think nature is so ideal for the treatment of anxiety and stress disorders, because again, it's this overactive, overstimulated brain that is constantly feels like it has to think through worst case scenarios, because that's really anxiety's worst case scenario will happen, and then what do I do? And what we see when we're in natural environments, it really, that nervous system kicks in and things start slowing down. There's a pace that begins to slow down. And we can help people let go of some of those worries, but just moving through the forest in slow ways. There's a whole big area of study now coming out of Japan called forest therapy, or Shinrin-yoku forest bathing. And all they're doing is talking about people moving in forest environments and becoming slow and mindful, and the body starts calming down and the mind then follows. Great question. Let's get through a couple more slides before we get to more questions. So my clinical observation before I did my research study was I would ask my patients, what gives you meaning in life? Where or when do you feel most alive? Describe a spiritual moment. Where or when do you feel closest to God? What helps you improve your mood? What helps you put things into perspective? And the answers for a lot of my clients was always, it was nature. So what I found in my research was an increase in connection to nature corresponded with an increase in psychological well-being, in addition to nurturing one's spirituality. So people would speak about spiritual experiences in nature, not simply one's connection to nature provided mental health benefits. So here's what a nature-informed therapy session often looks like. It's really a mind, body, spirit type of treatment. When we are in natural environment, what I see is the mind tends to be much more in the present moment. Now, depression is often the mind is more in the past. It's ruminating on past events, what we could have done, should have done differently. Anxiety is the mind more in the future. Worst case scenario will happen. And when that happens, what will I do? The present moment is where we see most of our mental health flourishing. And then we talked about soft fascination. Shinrin-yoku, the forest bathing, is really a body effect. So this is when your nervous system starts exhaling and calming down. And then we talked a little bit about the spiritual part, which the way I define spirituality from my lens is an experience of awe or transcendence. Distress tolerance, we talked about the domestication of our species and being addicted to comfort. And this is really where nature is wonderful, because it often provides us with some type of discomfort. Camping, you might get cold or wet. There are ticks and mosquitoes, right? So nature has a wonderful way to help us learn to lean into discomfort, and we call that distress tolerance. The experience of awe. When I ask people to tell me about an experience of awe, 9 out of 10 times it was something that happened to them in a natural environment. Doesn't have to be the Grand Canyon. It could be experiencing, something in their own backyard. If we have the eyes to see it, awe is all around us. Let's do another quick poll. Where in nature do you experience awe most frequently? So mountains or lakes, oceans or seashores, walk in the woods, or your own backyard? Where in nature do you experience awe most frequently? Okay, lots of people are voting mountains and lakes for a place to experience awe. We see oceans and seashores also, but we really do see that mountains and lakes are taking the lead here. We have 44% of people say that in nature, it's mountains and lakes where they experience awe most frequently. Nature has the power to heal because it is where we are from. It is where we belong, and it belongs to us as an essential part of our health and our survival. Really love that quote. Next steps, if you're interested in the work that we do, connecting nature and mental health, look us up. We do have a grand opening event, the Center for Nature Informed Therapy, coming up on April 18th at Pawtuck in the Pines. You can learn a lot more about the work we do. We offer backpacking, hiking groups, nature immersion weekends, all with a lens of how can we help you have better mental health through your relationship with the natural world. And I would just open it up to a few more questions if anybody had more questions, thoughts, or comments.
Yes, we have a question. You did also touch on this as well, but Lisa would like to know if you could expand a bit more and talk about the relationship between ADHD and soft fascination / nature.
Yes, sure, absolutely. So again, soft fascination is this interesting state of mind that that our mind really goes into when we're in natural environments. And like I said, in Japan, we're seeing data come out that says that it happens as quickly as 20 minutes into our walk in the forest. Now, what often happens with, let's say, children with that have ADHD, there's always something to capture your attention in nature. And also what we have found to be really helpful for children that have ADHD or ADD is really using sensory stimulation. So picking up things, feeling them, movement is really helpful. And when we're in natural environments, we often do a lot of that. Now, Richard Louv, if you're really interested in that connection between ADHD and nature, Richard Louv, his book Last Child in the Woods really addresses that. He even did an experiment where he took children out in the woods that were all on Ritalin, a medication used for ADHD, and had them actually come off the Ritalin in nature, and were able to find that they were stable and able to concentrate and do their schoolwork, but it was all happening in a natural setting. So very interesting correlation there. Any other questions?
Yeah, we have a question here. Do you think resilience to be an opposite of anxiety, and can resilience be learned throughout life?
Oh, I love that question. That is a wonderful question. So I really do. Before getting more into the nature research, I did a lot of research on resiliency, also known as post-traumatic growth rather than PTSD, post-traumatic growth. So what we find is absolutely resiliency can be learned. So positive psychology is a new form, a recently new form of psychology where we're looking at we're kind of moving away from the disease model to see what's wrong with people and how to treat them. And we're moving more towards, let's look at people that are showing extraordinary resiliency. What do those people have in common? And so what we have found is what those people have in common can actually be learned. Now, when I talked about distress tolerance, that's a really important piece to building resiliency. So if life is comfortable and has no obstacles, it's not good grounds for working on resiliency. Nature has obstacles. Just spend a week camping and you will experience that. And we find that the more we expose ourselves to obstacles and discomforts, the more we learn how to deal with these things and have coping skills, which is part of growing into resiliency. Nature is a perfect way to learn how to be resilient. Is there
Thank
anything
you.
else?
Yeah, thank you, Heidi. I think we'll bring in Dr. Roberts now.
Yes,
There are a couple of other
wonderful.
questions, but I know that, we can get to
Yes,
those towards the
absolutely.
end. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, hopefully everyone can see this and hear me okay. Um, Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm thrilled to speak and, following up after the wonderful talk with Dr. Schreiber-Pan. That's really been a great introduction to kind of what I'm going to pivot to talking about. And my presentations really will focus more so on looking at the inequities or kind of exploring, understanding what happens when we don't have that access to nature. So I kind of divided my presentation into 3 parts, and all 3 parts really will attempt to kind of tell a story about the evolutionary relationship of Africans, or rather African Americans, and nature specifically. And each part is threaded through the theme of structural racism and its influence on health inequities is demonstrated through the presence of nature access, as well as green space equity and green space privilege. The first part really is more of just a historical examination of where we've been. The second part will look at issues of today. And then the third part will just kind of look at where we're headed. So again, this first part is more of a historical examination. I hope it will give you some context to the issues that I raised later on in the presentation. So if we go to the very beginning, when bodies were pilfered from Africa and brought to what was to become United States of America, we need to recognize that these human beings were taken from a land where they had developed a very intimate relationship with nature. Very much as Dr. Schreiber-Pan had talked about, they were hunter-gatherers, they were herders of sheep, goats, cattle. They were also farmers. Consequently, when they came to this country as slaves, a new relationship with nature had to be developed. Nearly every aspect of their experience as a slave put them in contact with the natural environment and gave them a knowledge that was not only detailed, but also practical. During this time, though, the extent in terms of the measure of wealth in Southern society was the extent of land and slave ownership. But interestingly, as the plantation owners gained more wealth through these means, they became more removed from the land and more removed from the whole natural world. This removed relationship reduced their effectiveness in controlling their slaves and decreased their chances of finding fugitive slaves. But interestingly, also, this gave more knowledge to the slaves. So, for example, maroon communities were developed, which were created by runaway slaves who intended to leave the plantation, but not the South permanently. And with their ability of their knowledge of nature, through finding food in these uncultivated lands, they were able to live together for many years and even generations. So in essence, slaves, or rather these new African-American population, they developed their own uses of nature that were pretty much a hybrid of African traditions and practices produced by the conditions of their bondage. And many of these included things that just, understanding the movement of the stars, the sun, or even looking at moss on trees to create some kind of landmarking and direction. So again, both plantation owners as well as slaves during this time used nature to reinforce their own class interests, because nature constantly fought its cultivation and its taming. Enormous efforts were put in place to not only build the plantation, but also maintain them. And there was a common perspective, a common white perspective of the time, that nature was something to really be dominated and to be controlled. And controlling nature was really necessary for not only political power, but social standing, as well as the economic success of the time. In contrast, slaves held a very different view of nature. The African and African-American perspective of nature was one of harmony and good use. But now, in order to control nature, the plantation owners also had to control their slaves that worked the land. So they created these geography of containments, which were aimed to control slave mobility in space and time. So there were some slaves who actually had very limited geographic knowledge other than the plantation in which they resided. There were some slaves, however, who actually created this rival geography that was both on and off the plantation. And this was purposely really just to kind of find these hiding spaces. So if you see this figure right here, you see all of this uncultivated land in the woods surrounding this 4,500 acre plantation. So they would find these hiding spaces that would just give them a little bit of respite of time. They could move there freely, undetected in these uncultivated lands. And in essence, they were also able to acquire this region's knowledge of the woods and the fields. Another thing that's interesting also during this time is the ingenuity, in the sense that this popular hairstyle of cornrows, which derived from African origins, was also used for creating maps of nature. And these would be kind of delivered in secrecy to other slaves so that you could see, looking at the hairstyle, how to navigate in these uncultivated areas. They also used these to secure foods when they were on attempting to escape. So they would put seeds or rice, before their journey. And then that has actually been very much documented. And then there's this other aspect, which has been shown in some kinds of stories that have been carried over the years, in the sense that when they were fugitives, they would use this famous food of hush puppies to quiet the bloodhound dogs who were looking for them when they were running away. So let's fast forward. Fast forward to the Reconstruction period after the Civil War. Despite the end of slavery, the declaration that African Americans were US citizens and had the right to vote, many of them were systematically impoverished and disenfranchised through the sharecropping system, as well as the Black codes. And also during this time, white supremacy was rampant. There was a reign of terror that was maintained by groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. And so there was a time that it was very terrorizing in the South. And as a result, millions of former slaves actually left the South, what is called the Great Migration. As a result of the poor economic conditions, as well as the terror of this Jim Crow South. There was actually two migrations. There's the first migration between 1915 and 1940, then the second 1940 between 1970. And combined, there was approximately 6 million African Americans who left the South. And you saw this increasing percentage in the share of African Americans in cities. So for example, in Gary, Indiana, there was about 2% African Americans who lived there in 1910, but by 1940, that increased to 18%. And so again, the motivation to leave the South was pretty much, to leave these impoverished conditions in hopes for a better future, but also to leave the racist and dehumanizing conditions of the South. However, segregation was not legalized in the North as it was in the South. Racism and the prejudice was still widespread, but a large portion of African Americans live now in these urban areas, so quite different from the rural natural areas where they lived in the South. These were these cramped, dilapidated, impoverished conditions, and these were completely different from the nature-filled rural South which they had left. And the housing, again, was segregated. And even though they were economic employments, or the employment opportunities afforded them higher pay and better, economic situations, the working conditions were still very arduous and very dirty. And also during this time, there's a lot of tension that was going on in terms of, these new migrant African Americans that were coming from the South. There were tensions coming back from a lot of World War II, veterans coming back. And so there was still like this whole very tense, stressful period in which African Americans were now living in these urban areas. So I have a poll question. Given what I have told you so far, the question is, the move to urban cities from the Jim Crow South during the Great Migration brought greater economic opportunities, but it also shortened the lives of African Americans. This is a true false question, but there's multiple choices. Is it true just for men, true just for women, true for both, or false for both? Okay, we have about 80%, 88, 90% saying true for both. Okay. And actually, yep, that is actually very much correct. So yes, it was true for both. So as you can see, the mortality rate, there was research that actually came out that was published in the American Economic in 2015. And even though for a long time, people all thought that, oh, you know, a lot of African Americans are going up north, they have more education opportunities, more economic opportunities. So therefore, you know, this should improve their longevity. Actually, this research found the opposite. Mortality rates increased 40% for men and 50% for women. And so this is an interesting phenomenon in the sense that they moved from these very, you know, rural, yes, they were, you know, situations that weren't in the best situations, but they moved from these rural environments to these very urbanized environments that brought in a whole different level of stressors. So now let's kind of pivot and go to where we are today. Since April of last year, you know, the news media has been filled with headlines revealing these startling race and ethnic-based disparities of COVID-19 deaths and COVID-19 cases. I'm going to show you two graphs. This first one shows the cumulative mortality rates of COVID by race and ethnic group from the beginning of the pandemic to last December. And you can see that, you know, the COVID rates for all people of color, with the exception of Asian, was 3 times higher than for white people. Now, this next one, this one is from December until present day of March. And you can still see that there's still, you know, great disparities, but we also see that the mortality rate actually for Pacific Islanders has actually increased while other communities of color experienced a slight decrease. But even still, all groups of color except for the Asian population has a COVID mortality rate at least twice as high than the white Americans. Now, this is interesting because we think about how this is related to nature. So in 2020 of last year, the Centers for Disease Control, they had suggested that visiting parks and recreational facilities, particularly those that were close to your home, was a way to protect yourself from others and from COVID. But almost half of Americans don't have a park within a 10-minute walk of their home. The quality of park is also significantly correlated with neighborhood demographics. We have seen research that parks that serve a majority of people of color are half as big and serve nearly 5 times as many per acre. So with these kind of constraints and people trying to flood to parks, we saw this park pressure, particularly during the height of the pandemic and during the quarantine period. So again, the quality of park is highly correlated with neighborhood demographics. It's a pattern that we see across the US where the nicest parks tend to be in the wealthiest and widest neighborhoods. And this research has been shown by the Trust for Public Land. Here we see an example of this woman. She was interviewed. Her name is Dolly. She lives in a neighborhood in South Chattanooga. And this is her park right here, right next to a small neighborhood park, which is kind of shoehorned by this cellulose plant and biofuels factory that processes used grease and lard into animal feed. Conversely, about 4 miles away and across the Tennessee River, you see this really meticulously maintained Coolidge Park. And it's interesting because she was saying how, you know, other than the difference between distance, what is the difference? You know, well, in Raquetta's neighborhood, it's 95% African American, but the two neighborhoods around the Coolidge Park is about 75% to 95% white. So in order for us to really appreciate this, the intricacies of this issue, we really have to kind of look at some of the policies and practices that were sanctioned by federal and local governments, which really still have impact on lives of African Americans and many other communities of color today. Everything from redlining, blockbusting, urban renewal has this lasting effect of where and how African Americans live in their built and their social environments, as well as their natural environments and the downstream health disparities and inequities that they experience. And so one example of a disparity that we've seen, is this regard to nature access. Again, communities of color are almost 3 times more likely than white communities to live in nature-deprived areas. And one thing that I kind of want to focus on is this whole idea of what happened during urban renewal. I won't get into all the details of urban renewal, but I want to give you an example of something that is was in my backyard. So I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and this is a picture before and after urban renewal. And you can see here that there was initially Frederick Law Olmsted Parkway, this Humboldt Parkway in the top picture. It was this beautiful parkway. And my mom used to always talk about it when I was a kid. And I always used to be like, Mom, what are you talking about? And then I saw the picture before, and then what I grew up with, the expressway was always there when I saw it. And so I see the difference between what was this beautiful park that was available, which now is no longer available because we have this expressway here. So this whole idea was predicated on the historical racism in housing practices and city planning institutions. It pretty much shaped the patterns of residential patterns, which subsequently shaped the patterns of, where we see our parks. And so again, this is a red line map of where I grew up in Buffalo, New York. And you can see here, obviously that the green and the blue are the best areas. But what's interesting too is right here is our Delaware Park. This is our city treasure. It's about 350 acres of beautiful park, which was actually also landscaped by Frederick Law Olmsted. And you can see, where it is placed. And so this is something that is a phenomenon that is not only, just in Buffalo where I grew up, but in many cities throughout the United States. So what does this all mean, this inequity with nature? Well, it translates to health inequity. Research and published in the Lancet, which is a very highly regarded journal, it showed that, increasing increments of residential green space was significantly associated with reducing all-cause mortality. So basically, all of this, just everything on the left-hand side of this one line is saying that it reduced mortality because all of these studies showed that people had access to green space. This was an interesting finding because we saw that last year, life expectancy actually dropped because of the pandemic for about approximately for a 1 year drop. But for African Americans, the decline was almost 3 years. And so you think about that in terms of the lack of access, the reduction in life expectancy, and you see all this, as this kind of constellation of worst case scenario. Research has also shown that access to park decreases prevalence of obesity in children. But what's interesting about this is this was statistically significant only in Black children. So yes, there was a reduction in the other groups of white children, Hispanic children in this research, but the children where it was most significant were the Black children. And so this also, shows the benefit of nature in terms of reducing obesity and improving health. So I'm going to go to another poll question. This one, there's no right or wrong answer. This is more just an opinion. Several sociologists and researchers have argued that slavery and other racial oppression had a direct impact on African Americans' relationship with relationship. Do you strongly agree, strongly disagree, disagree, or don't know? So we have about 38%, roughly 35% who strongly agree, another 29% who agree, about 12% who strongly strongly disagree or disagree, and another 28 who says, I don't know. Okay, I like to see kind of like this nice distribution of opinions of this topic. So let me go to the next slide. What we have seen is that, oops. What we have seen is that the relationship, some scholars have said that, particularly this one scholar, her name is Dr. Kimberly Smith. She's a professor of political science and environmental studies at Carleton College. She stated that humans' relationship with nature is affected by the justice or injustice of their social surroundings. Other scholars have also argued that slavery and other racial oppression has had a direct impact on African Americans' relationship to nature and their interaction with nature. And it's interesting because we've also seen with some other scholars how this is also played out in nature policies. For example, the Wilderness Act. Dr. Carolyn Finney, she's a cultural geographer. She's argued that, you know, African American presence in the great outdoors was removed by racial bias, and that there was a general lack of attention to Black outdoor spaces. And so I think a lot of this has actually informed the actual connection of nature with a lot of African Americans, but also I think it's also informed the relationship or the perception of how African Americans are perceived in nature. So for example, this situation happened last summer with Christian Cooper, and this whole ideal of kind of questioning a man of color, a Black man in a natural space, was something that people started to now, you know, look at, you know, critically. And so this incident really highlighted kind of this issue of structural racism and exclusion and white privilege, and how these issues intersect with nature connectedness and nature equity. So in this last few minutes, I kind of want to talk about now, well, where are we going next? It is wonderful to know that the Jim Crow style of terror in nature is no longer a common occurrence. The legacy of these institutionalized exclusion of African Americans from recreational areas, however, still does persist. Due to years of discrimination for many people, the experience of being outdoors can feel more like an effort to conquer the fear than an enjoyment for its own sake, unfortunately. And too often, I've even experienced this myself personally, you know, you may face unwelcoming or sometimes overwhelming stares and questions and attitudes while recreating in these natural spaces that kind of dispel this discomfort in places that should be really a safe respite. And so I like to think of green justice equal to racial justice equal to health justice. And in my own way, I have created my own way of achieving this justice by becoming one of the co-founders of Nature RX at UMD. And so this actually is a program at the University of Maryland. It was born out of the initiative of Park RX America. And Park RX America is basically a nonprofit organization, and their mission is really to decrease the burden of chronic disease, increase health and happiness, and foster environmental stewardship, pretty much by virtue of prescribing nature during routine healthcare delivery. And so out of this, we created our own Nature RX at UMD on campus. Our mission is to highlight and leverage the natural spaces of our campus arboretum for the purpose of health and well-being and environmental stewardship. We launched this on Earth Day of 2019, and with many different activities from morning qigong or morning yoga and afternoon qigong. We had a climbing clean in our back where the creek is, and it was just wonderful, many different things that we did to really get people reacquainted with nature and get outside of the buildings that are on our campus. With the pandemic, we've hit some roadblocks, but we have three main goals. Our three main goals are to start prescribing nature prescriptions to students, because as Dr. Schrieber-Pan had said, a lot of our students are really dealing with stress, anxiety, and depression. We've seen those rates, particularly in the collegiate age, increase over the years. And so we want to start to prescribe nature prescriptions. And that's one of our main goals that we want to do, particularly through our peer program in our health services. We also want to expand our nature-based education through courses. I'm actually going to be developing a course myself to launch next fall. And then also extend the nature-based research that we do with other universities and other institutions. And this is something that is kind of a growing kind of initiative that we want to do that will hopefully expand to the greater, not only the campus, but Prince George's County and throughout Maryland. And finally, last year, we celebrated our first Campus Nature RX Symposium. These are many of the colleges. This is not exhaustive list, but these are other universities and colleges in the United States that have similar Campus Nature RX programs. And so it was great that we had our online symposium last year, which was really something that we were a learning experience, so we could see what everyone was doing and what we could, learn. Finally, I also want to hopefully debunk some stereotypes, to really, particularly for our students of color on campus, to really let them know that, nature is a space for them, to have them think that this is some place that they don't need to feel excluded from. And this is one of the things that I have always, found a passion in. I love nature. And I hope my goal is for everyone to enjoy it as well. And so here's a couple photos from our campus. And again, the goal is helping UMD students and the greater community realize that nature is for everyone. So if anyone's interested to learn more about our program, we have this manuscript that was published in January. And I am open to questions. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. We have a question here for you. What are the most important changes you would hope to see in Maryland on the level of the individual, smaller communities, and the state as a whole?
Changes in, could you repeat the question again? Changes in?
Yeah, just what are the most important changes that you would hope to see?
I feel like that's a broad question, but I guess if I had to say changes, I think changes dealing in general health inequities. That's one big thing. And when I say health inequities, that covers everything from, access to green space, access to vaccines, just dealing with inequities and but looking at it from the social determinants of health. A lot of times we look downstream and we look at things once things have already occurred, but looking at, well, why are these things occurring? So do people have, equal access to parks? Do people have safe housing? Do people have, access to healthcare? And I know there's a broad answer to the question, but I also kind of felt like the question was a little bit broad in terms of if I could change anything in Maryland. I think that would probably be one of the first things that I would try to, if I had my magic wand, to.
Thank you. We have a follow-up question from a question earlier from Jacqueline. Could outdoor prescriptions be part of managing ADHD for children? Has this been explored? I know, Dr. Roberts, you're talking about the prescriptions as well, nature prescriptions for students. So maybe I could put that to both of you, like how do these nature prescriptions help as a kind of form of opening access and maybe for therapy as well? Whoever wants to go first.
Sure, I do know that there is a group, I forget the exact name, but I think it is something like Park RX. I don't know, Dr. Robertson, if you know more about them, but they're a group of physicians, primary care physicians and pediatricians that are actually going ahead and prescribing nature. They use an app, for example, for ADHD, but I know it's used for adults with like high blood pressure to go to a local park, start walking there, and then they send their progress back to their doctor saying that they have completed their prescription. So I know that is up and coming. I don't know exactly how much is happening on the end of for children with ADHD.
Yeah, I can't speak specifically to that one specific health outcome, but I do know, Robert Zar, who actually started the whole
Yeah.
Park RX initiative, started prescribing for his pediatric population. And so I do know he's been trying to push to make it open for other clinicians and healthcare providers throughout the US to look at this as an option, as a tool to either be a supplement to already medicinal therapies, or maybe as an alternative, to medicinal therapies to deal with a variety of health outcomes. So like I said, I can't speak specifically to ADHD, but I definitely know has prescribed it for his pediatric population.
All right, I think we have time for one more quick question. Dr. Roberts, can you just kind of talk a bit about how everyone can be involved in helping African Americans reinvent connections to natural spaces?
I think a matter of that being inclusive, so if you're going out to a green, I think sometimes we think really big, but if we think small, and if you're saying, you're going out to a green space, or you're going, to even something in small in your backyard, an inclusivity in terms of bringing people. And I also do really believe in starting from a younger age, because when you develop that fondness of nature and that comfort with nature, I've seen this even with children. There's the children who are very early on comfortable, they won't get freaked out by little bugs in nature, versus children who have not had that experience. But bringing them together and including, and then also, we all have our own implicit biases. So maybe if we go to different spaces and you maybe have never seen an African American in, the Grand Canyon or this part, to not overly look or overly engaged, but, just treat them as any other person. And I think that's one of those things that will come in time, because a lot of what I discussed are things that happen over generation and generation, and you can't repair it overnight. But I think just kind of recognizing our own implicit biases, and also being inclusive to people who may not look like you when you go to these green spaces.
And if I might add to that, Dr. Robertson, I'm not sure if you're familiar with backyard base camps, but it's a really wonderful organization that's turning vacant lots in the city into green spaces for the community. So if you are looking for an organization to support in that way, we're fans of them, and we're also a partnership with them to bring mental health to those spaces for more closer to the city.
Right. Yeah. That's a good suggestion, Heidi.
Well, we are out of time, unfortunately. I want to thank you both for such great presentations and all the wealth of knowledge that you shared with our attendees today. So thank you very much for a really informative webinar and for joining us. And we want to thank today's attendees and ask you if you could take a minute or two to fill out our post-webinar survey. We should have the link for that in the chat box. We'll also be emailing you that, so we really do appreciate your input. Our next webinar in the series will be held on April 21st at 12. Biologist and conservationist Heather Home will be presenting on pollinators, backyard habitat, and why it matters. So to register for this webinar and the others in our series, please go to the Foundation's website at forevermaryland.org/learn. Once again, thank you, Dr. Roberts. Thank you, Dr. Schreiber-Pan. This concludes today's presentation, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Have a great one. Bye-bye.